Hi, I am Caitlin Hingling, and I will be speaking about the frequency hopper detection using Yolo project that CACI has been researching this year. I will be going over the approach and various experiments conducted during this project. Frequency hopping signals often require labor-intensive analysis by humans to identify and process due to their unique signal characteristics. Hop patterns can cover a wide bandwidth over varied segments in time, which can be difficult for a human to discern. This project investigates methods to leverage Yolo, an emerging computer vision technology that can identify objects in cluttered images to detect frequency hoppers. The image shows an example of a frequency hopper in a cluttered environment. It is hard for us to tell where the frequency hopper is, but will Yolo be able to detect it? We will revisit this image later on. One approach to rapidly learn new patterns in images is to leverage the You Only Look Once, or Yolo, algorithm. Yolo focuses on producing accurate classifications in real time with limited training data and has gained popularity because of its superior performance on object detection. One common use of Yolo focuses on object detection in images for situations like autonomous driving. These algorithms need to quickly locate and classify multiple objects for navigation and safety applications, as shown in the image. The Yolo algorithm drastically reduces time and boosts performance for object detection tasks. For example, the Yolo algorithm is pre-trained on the Common Objects in Context, or COCO, dataset, which contains images that are in a cluttered, realistic environment given a specific context. This dataset shares similar characteristics of a spectrogram and coincides with a wideband snapshot of a radio frequency environment, where a signal must be quickly located, identified, and processed in near real time to provide continual situational awareness. CACI hypothesizes Yolo can successfully detect frequency hopper patterns across a wideband snapshot, similar to how Yolo conducts object detection in cluttered environments. This research leveraged baseband IQ data generated from synthetic RF waveforms for a variety of digital signal types with a focus on frequency hoppers. Spectrograms were generated from multiple power spectral densities of the data over time to form a 2D image. The spectrogram is similar to images commonly found in the Yolo dataset in that it is a grayscale 2D display of pixels. The accuracy of Yolo was evaluated on both narrowband bursts of energy and wideband frequency hoppers. Traditional signal detectors struggle to identify frequency hoppers due to their variable hop pattern over a wideband snapshot. The traditional collection and identification of hop patterns is time-consuming and challenging for humans to identify, but the Yolo technique showed promise for this situation. There were two primary areas investigated during this research. Study 1 used Yolo to create an energy detector that detected individual bursts of energy in a wideband snapshot. The high-level pipeline is shown in the top left image with an example of the training data in the top right image. Study 2 used Yolo to create a frequency hopper detector that identified a frequency hop pattern in a noisy environment with other signals, or interferers. The high-level pipeline is shown in the bottom left image with an example of the training data in the bottom right image. For Study 2, additional data needed to be created in order to include the interferers. The interferers were used to simulate a noisy environment. The boxes outlined in red show the additional steps required. The input data consisted of two pickle files, one with the IQ data and the other with metadata describing signal characteristics of the IQ data. These files were pre-processed before being fed into the Yolo algorithm, including generating spectrogram images and calculating bounding box dimensions around the signal of interest. This project used 3 different patterns of frequency hoppers, with one pattern being shown in the image as an example. Some of the experiments used the same relative pattern but with hops shifted in frequency, and others used different patterns altogether. Both data variations were used to test the ability of the Yolo algorithm to either detect an individual burst of energy or group of hot patterns depending on the experiment being conducted. Interferer data was also created and included noise, a narrowband binary phase shift keying or BPSK signal, and frequency hoppers with randomized patterns of varying durations. To start the preprocessing, the IQ data was converted to an image by calculating spectrograms. Since Yolo expected a square image, the FFT and number of segments were set equal. The resulting image was 1024 by 1024 pixels with time on the x-axis and frequency on the y-axis. For both studies, the first part of preprocessing set up the data differently depending on if the algorithm is used for training or testing. If the data was used for training, bounding boxes were calculated. The bounding box coordinates were output into a text file that contained 5 numbers per box: class, horizontal center, vertical center, width, and height. Each image had a corresponding label with the bounding box information. If the data was used for testing, only the images were created. The calculations for the bounding boxes were dependent on the signal type. For the purposes of this project, frequency hoppers with a 2FSK modulation type were used. To determine the bounding box of each burst of energy in the frequency hopper, multiple calculations were made. First, the bandwidth was calculated to give the box height. Next, the number of samples per hop was used in conjunction with the FFT bin size to produce the box width. Using the start time and duration provided the horizontal center. To calculate the vertical center, center frequency of the signal was used. Each of the 4 calculations were scaled to match Yolo's axis values. Additional preprocessing was needed to prepare the data for Study 2, which used Yolo to detect a frequency hopper in an environment with interferers. To create an image that contained both the signal of interest and interferers, the spectrogram images were stitched together. The signal of interest was randomly placed in the stitched image in order to vary the frequency hopper over frequency and time. In some experiments, additional interferer bursts were randomly added throughout all 4 images, including in band within the signal of interest. The size of the stitched image containing the signal of interest and 3 random interferers was 2048 by 2048, which was automatically scaled down by Yolo to 1024 by 1024. Yolo is an object detection algorithm that works by dividing images into a grid system, and then each cell in the grid detects objects within itself. Yolo contains 3 main pieces: the backbone, neck, and head. The backbone is a convolutional neural network that aggregates and forms image features at different granularities. The neck is a series of layers to mix and combine image features to pass forward to prediction. And the head consumes features produced from the neck and makes the prediction. To determine how well the algorithm performed, the mean average precision, or MAP score, was used. The MAP score is the average of the average precision values. The average precision score is calculated from the area under the precision recall curve. For this project, the MAP score was calculated over the range 0.5 to 0.95 with a step size of 0.05, which were the intersection over union, or IOU, thresholds. The image on the top shows an example of the IOUs for each object in the image. The output of Yolo produces training and validation images. The validation images contained predicted bounding boxes around the signal of interest, along with a confidence score for each box. If Yolo gave a bounding box a high confidence score, then Yolo most likely predicted the correct object. The image on the bottom shows an example of confidence scores for each object in the image. The first experiment conducted was to determine if transfer learning would reduce training time and produce more accurate results over the other ways of training. Yolo can be trained in 3 ways: from scratch, using pre-trained weights, and using transfer learning. Training Yolo from scratch uses only custom data provided and is initialized with random weights. Training Yolo from pre-trained weights uses weights that correspond to one of the model sizes and the COCO dataset. Training Yolo using transfer learning freezes some of the layers in a pre-trained model, and then updates weights in the unfrozen layers based upon the custom dataset. The data used for this experiment was a 2FSK frequency hopper shown in detail A on the left. The image on the right shows 4 examples of the ground truth bounding box labels for individual bursts of energy within the frequency hopper. The image on the left shows the output from Yolo trained with pre-trained weights, predicting bounding box locations for individual bursts of energy within the frequency hopper, including the confidence scores for each box. These predictions can be compared to the ground truth labels in the previous slide. The results of this experiment are shown in the table. Based on these results, training Yolo with pre-trained weights produced the best results, proving the hypothesis incorrect. Experiment 2 focused on Yolo input parameters. Yolo provides a few input parameters that could be leveraged for possible hypertuning, such as choosing between mosaic and rectangular tiles. Mosaic combines 4 randomly selected images into a single image. The size and shape of the small images can be different. The rectangular option sorts the images by aspect ratio of the entire dataset, combining similar images, which can speed up processing. The image on the left shows how Yolo processes the images with the rectangular argument. Each box is labeled with 0 because for this project, all bursts of energy were in the same class. The image on the right shows how Yolo processes the images using the mosaic argument. Running the same dataset through Yolo while keeping everything the same but changing the argument from mosaic and rectangular resulted in the rectangular option providing better results. The table shows the map scores for each parameter. The image on the left shows the prediction results with the confidence scores from training Yolo with the rectangular argument. The image on the right shows the prediction results with the confidence scores from training Yolo with the mosaic argument. Experiment 3 determined which model size was used to train during experiments. Yolo offers models ranging in size from nano to extra large that have been pre-trained on the COCO dataset. As the size increases, the model becomes more accurate but slower. For this project, the large and extra large models were not tested due to GPU resources used. To determine which model size to use, the same data with the same input parameters were run with each model size. Based on map scores and time required to run, the median model size was chosen as the optimum model for all signal experiments. Experiment 4 focused on Study 2, detecting the signal of interest in an image with interferers. Each dataset used in this experiment focused on increasing the complexity of the signal environment from a frequency hopper with just noise to a frequency hopper pattern with various interferers. To test the identification of a pattern of hops, 4 images were stitched together to form one image consisting of the signal of interest and interferers. These interferers include narrowband signals and other frequency hoppers. The frequency hoppers are both similar and different to the signal of interest to determine if the model can detect between the signal of interest and an interferer. To ensure the model does not learn the position of the signal of interest, the hopper and the interferers were randomly placed in different positions within the stitched image. The interferers were also placed in various locations within the image to create a more realistic single image. The goal was to have the signal of interest and the interferers visually hard to tell apart by humans, but the model would still be able to detect the signal of interest. This was evaluated 3 different ways. The first way was to initially stitch the images together with the spectrograms already created. A second way was to cluster the signal of interest and the interferers close together within the 4 quadrants. The third was to spread out the signal of interest and the interferers over the 4 quadrants to encapsulate the entire 2048 by 2048 image. With the method of spreading out the signal of interest and interferers, random interferers were also placed within the same image as the signal of interest to make it look more realistic and difficult for Yolo to detect. The interferers are described in the table. The frequency hopper stayed consistent for datasets 1 through 3, but the interferers were changed. For datasets 4 and 5, the signal of interest was either condensed or spread out, which was used as a step to eliminate the obvious delineation between the signal of interest and the interferers. Detail A on the left shows an example of a signal of interest in a cluttered environment as described in dataset 2. The image on the right shows 4 examples of the ground truth bounding box labels around the signal of interest in the described environment. The image on the left shows 4 examples of the output from Yolo, trained with pre-trained weights, predicting bounding box locations for dataset 2, including confidence scores for each box. The prediction can be compared to the ground truth labels in the previous slide. The table shows the results training Yolo the 3 ways mentioned in experiment 1. Training with pre-trained weights performed the best. Detail A on the left shows an example of a signal of interest in a cluttered environment as described in dataset 4. The image on the right shows 4 examples of the ground truth bounding box labels around the signal of interest in the described environment. The image on the left shows 4 examples of the output from Yolo, trained with pre-trained weights, predicting bounding box locations for dataset 4, including confidence scores for each box. The predictions can be compared to the ground truth labels in the previous slide. The table shows the results training Yolo with pre-trained weights performed the best. Detail A on the left shows an example of a signal of interest with no interferers. Detail B shows an example of the signal of interest in a cluttered environment as described in dataset 5 with interferers added. Detail B is the same image previously shown when discussing the problem statement. As shown in the next slide, Yolo is able to detect the frequency hopper, whereas it is hard for us to tell where it is. The image on the right shows 4 examples of the ground truth bounding box labels around the signal of interest in the described environment. The image on the left shows 4 examples of the output from Yolo, trained with pre-trained weights, predicting bounding box locations for dataset 5, including confidence scores for each box. The predictions can be compared to the ground truth labels in the previous slide. The table shows the results training Yolo with pre-trained weights and transfer learning performed similarly. Based on the findings of these experiments, Yolo can be used as both an energy detector and frequency hopper detector. It was able to successfully detect individual bursts of energy in a frequency hopper, as well as detect a specific frequency hopper in a cluttered environment. Various experiments were conducted to determine how well Yolo performed with the signal data. A few of the experiments were conducted to determine the best input parameters to use when training Yolo, such as model size and the way Yolo breaks up the images. Another experiment conducted was to determine what type of learning was best for signal data, from scratch, pre-trained weights, or transfer learning. It was determined that training from pre-trained weights rather than transfer learning gave the best results. After determining the best way to train Yolo, 2 methods of detections were tested: detecting individual bursts of energy in a frequency hopper and detecting a frequency hop pattern in a cluttered environment. Yolo performed well for both methods. A few areas to further the research are classifying the frequency hoppers, detecting the presence of frequency hoppers with different patterns, using over-the-air or OTA data, and repeating hop patterns. In this research, all individual bursts of energy and frequency hoppers detected were trained on a single pattern labeled as signal. To take it a step further, the model could be trained on multiple different frequency hop patterns in an attempt to classify each. Similarly, it would be valuable to determine if a frequency hopper of any pattern was present in a wide spectrum field of signals. The data used in this research was generated from a signal generator. The next step would be to use real-world data, such as OTA data, to test if Yolo can still detect the individual bursts of energy or frequency hopper within interferers. Another iteration of the data would be using repeating hop patterns to determine if Yolo would construct a bounding box around each repeated instance or the box repeating the entire pattern. It would also be interesting to combine both methods of detection, detecting a specific frequency hopper in a cluttered environment and then detecting each individual burst of energy of the frequency hopper while ignoring in-band interferers. If you have any questions or would like any further details on the project, feel free to email any of the researchers listed below. Thank you for your time.